Have you ever watched a movie set in the Middle Ages and thought, wait, was it really like that? Filthy, toothless peasants, knights in rattling armour that weighs a ton, and everyone believing the earth was flat. Sound familiar? But what if I told you that almost everything Hollywood has shown us about the medieval era is a grand deception? Today, we're going on a journey to tear down 30 of the most persistent myths surrounding this time. We'll separate fact from fiction and discover how people truly lived, fought, loved, and thought 1,000 years ago. Get ready, because some of these facts might genuinely shock you and force you to reconsider everything you thought you knew. Ready for the truth? Let's dive in. Before we begin our debunking, let's figure out why cinema distorts history so much in the first place. The answer is simple: drama and spectacle. Directors need to create a vivid, easily digestible, and often exaggerated image to capture the audience. It's easier to portray the world in bleak, brown and grey tones to emphasise the darkness of the age than to recreate the complex and colourful reality. It's also much cheaper to dress up extras in sackcloth than in historically accurate linen and wool garments. Furthermore, many of these myths weren't born in Hollywood. They originated much earlier, during the Renaissance and the Age of Enlightenment. Thinkers of that era, seeking to highlight their own achievements, deliberately crafted the image of the Dark Ages as a time of decline and ignorance. This cartoonish image proved so resilient that the film industry gladly adopted it and continues to mass-produce it today. So, we won't just be battling cinematic inaccuracies, we'll be fighting a centuries-old tradition of historical distortion. Our mission is to restore the Middle Ages to its true, complex, and surprisingly fascinating identity. So let's tackle the most fragrant myth first. Pop culture insists that the Middle Ages were a period of absolute filth and zero hygiene. Supposedly, people refused to bathe for years, believing cleanliness was sinful, and cities were awash in waste. Screen heroes often proudly declare they haven't touched water since the previous Christmas. However, historical reality smelled quite different. Firstly, the legacy of the Roman Empire, with its culture of thermae and public baths, didn't vanish entirely. Many European cities maintained and even built new public bathhouses. These were more than just places to get clean. They were vital social hubs. People met here, chatted, and even closed deals. Secondly, soap was a widely available commodity. It was made from animal fats and lye, and entire guilds of soap makers existed. While it certainly wasn't the refined product we use today, it effectively served its purpose. Personal hygiene was a crucial part of etiquette, especially among the nobility. Washing hands before and after meals was a mandatory ritual, particularly since most people ate with their hands. Every wealthy household owned special vessels, called aqua menials, and basins specifically for hand washing. As for the church, the idea that it outright banned bathing is simply a myth manufactured during the Enlightenment. Yes, some extreme ascetics and hermits practiced abstaining from washing as a form of mortification of the flesh, but these were exceptions, not the general rule. On the contrary, hygiene was highly emphasized within monasteries, where sophisticated plumbing systems and dedicated washrooms were standard. Of course, their standards of cleanliness don't compare to modern levels. They lacked knowledge of germs, and urban sanitation systems often left much to be desired. But the idea that everyone was universally dirty and foul-smelling is a complete caricature. People valued cleanliness and maintained it using the methods available to them. Therefore, the trope of the perpetually grimy night is mostly a dramatic invention designed to heighten the effect. The next item on our list is the visual aesthetic of the era. Watch any movie set in the Middle Ages and what do you see? Grey castles, brown villages, and dull, earthy-coloured clothing. It seems like the world was devoid of colour, and that people consciously chose the most sombre shades available. This perception is fundamentally wrong. The Middle Ages was an incredibly bright and colourful world. People loved colour and used it everywhere. Clothing was the primary way to display status and wealth, and garments featured every colour of the rainbow. The dyes, of course, were natural, But that doesn't mean they were muted or drab. They were extracted from plants, insects, and minerals. For instance, the famous carmine red came from cochineal insects, indigo blue from plants, and bright yellow often from saffron or weld. The most expensive dyes, such as Tyrian purple, were imported from great distances, and only kings and the highest nobility could afford them. But even common peasants dyed their clothing in accessible colours like green, yellow, brown, and blue. Interestingly, grey and true black were actually some of the most difficult and expensive colours to produce, meaning only the wealthy could wear them consistently. This vibrancy wasn't limited to clothing. The walls of castles and churches were painted with frescoes featuring biblical narratives and intricate ornamentation. The illuminated manuscripts created by monks in scriptoriums are true works of art, shining with gold leaf and vivid pigments. Even the statues inside cathedrals were originally painted, but over time the pigments flaked away, leaving us with the familiar look of bare stone. So where did this myth of a grey Middle Ages originate? Partially, as we mentioned, it's a legacy of the Enlightenment, which sought to portray the preceding centuries as dark, and partially, it's simply the result of time. Colours faded and frescoes crumbled. Cinema simply picked up this stereotype because it easily creates the necessary atmosphere of decline and austerity. In reality, if we could step back into a medieval city, we would be astounded by a riot of colour, not by dreary greyness. Apply, leeches and pray. That's often the cinematic depiction of medieval medicine. The doctor in the film is usually either a charlatan or an ignorant monk, offering dubious rituals instead of treatment. Any serious wound or illness is almost always a death sentence. This image is not only unfair, it completely overlooks the significant medical advances of the era. While doctors certainly didn't know about bacteria or viruses, their approach was far from primitive. Medieval medicine was fundamentally based on the ancient theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was thought to arise from an imbalance of these fluids. Although the theory was flawed, it encouraged physicians to take a comprehensive, holistic approach. They prescribed specialised diets, physical exercise, herbal remedies, and yes, bloodletting, which they believed helped restore that essential balance. Surgery, in particular, was surprisingly advanced. Surgeons performed complex procedures such as amputations, cataract removal, and the extraction of stones from the kidneys and bladder. For pain relief, they used tinctures based on opium, mandrake, and henbane, a form of primitive anesthesia. Instruments were often sterilised using wine, which possesses natural antiseptic properties, even though they didn't understand the mechanism behind its efficacy. Europe also saw the establishment of its first medical faculties in universities like Salerno and Montpellier. Here, students studied the works of ancient physicians like Hippocrates and Galen, alongside the crucial contributions of Arab scholars, who were often far ahead of their European counterparts. The Arab physician Avicenna, or Ibn Sina, wrote the Canon of Medicine, which remained the primary medical textbook in Europe for centuries. Hospitals also existed, most often attached to monasteries. They provided care for the sick, shelter for travellers, and aid for the poor. Of course, the field was rife with superstition, and its effectiveness cannot compare to modern medicine. But to reduce it merely to leeches and prayer is to completely disregard the efforts and knowledge of thousands of healers who saved lives using the best methods available. It was a rational system based on observation and experience, not simply an age of dark ignorance. In those dark times, no one could read except for a couple of monks. This is another tired historical cliché. Hollywood loves showing illiterate kings and knights signing documents with an X, treating literacy like some kind of supernatural ability. The reality was far more nuanced and, frankly, more literate. While literacy rates were certainly lower than they are today, they were nowhere near zero. Let's break down who was reading and writing and why. First, the clergy. For priests and monks, Latin was the working language. They weren't just reading the Bible, They were copying texts, keeping meticulous chronicles, and engaging in science and philosophy. Monastic schools were the primary hubs of education. Second, the aristocracy. The notion that all knights were merely illiterate brutes is a persistent myth. Starting in the High Middle Ages, reading and writing became an essential part of a noble's education. Nobles needed literacy to understand laws, manage their sprawling estates, and handle correspondence. Many were also patrons of the arts, and some even wrote poetry themselves. For instance, the famous troubadours and trouvères, who popularised courtly love, often hailed from the noble class. Third, the burghers, or townspeople. With the growth of cities and the explosion of trade, literacy became a practical necessity for merchants, craftsmen, and administrators. They needed to keep accounts, draft contracts, and read local ordinances. Secular schools and universities emerged in cities, training lawyers, doctors, and administrators. Even among peasants, literacy wasn't completely unheard of, although it was certainly rarer. Some prosperous farmers could afford to send their sons to a church school. Crucially, there was a vast difference between simply being able to read, or passive literacy, and being able to write, or active literacy. Many could recognise a prayer or a signpost, but couldn't compose a coherent letter. Furthermore, most scholarly texts were in Latin, the language of the educated elite. However, as vernacular languages and literature began to flourish, literacy started to spread even further. So, the medieval world was not one of total ignorance or widespread illiteracy. It was a world where the book and the written word were highly valued and played a pivotal role in the structure of society. The term Dark Ages is perhaps the most pervasive and harmful misconception about the Middle Ages. It conjures up an image of a 1,000-year gap in human history, a period of stagnation, superstition, and intellectual decay wedged between the glories of antiquity and the brilliance of the Renaissance. This label was coined by the Italian poet Petrarch in the 14th century and enthusiastically adopted by humanists and Enlightenment thinkers who sought to elevate their own eras. But modern historians have completely abandoned the term because it simply doesn't reflect reality. The Middle Ages were, in fact, a time of incredible innovation and cultural development. Let's look at the facts. It was during this period that the first universities in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford were founded. These institutions became vital centres of intellectual life, laying the groundwork for our modern system of higher education. Here, scholasticism flourished, a philosophical movement that sought to rationally justify Christian doctrine. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas developed monumental philosophical systems based on Aristotelian logic. Architecture underwent a true revolution. The heavy, massive walls of the Romanesque style gave way to the soaring heights of Gothic architecture. Gothic cathedrals with their pointed arches, flying buttresses, and colossal stained glass windows remain engineering marvels that captivate the imagination even today. Technology was constantly advancing too. Innovations included the widespread adoption and improvement of watermills and windmills, which revolutionized agriculture and craft production. The introduction of the heavy-wheeled plough allowed vast new tracts of land to be cultivated. Militarily, the stirrup transformed knightly cavalry into a formidable fighting force. Gunpowder arrived in Europe in the 13th century. And in the 15th century, Johann Gutenberg invented the printing press, one of the single greatest achievements in human history. This was also an age of great exploration, highlighted by journeys like Marco Polo's travels to China. Of course, the Middle Ages were not without tragedy. The era saw devastating wars, famines, and the horrific epidemic of the Black Death. But to label this entire millennium dark is to willfully ignore the colossal contribution it made to European civilization. It was a time of construction, invention, and the very formation of the ideas and institutions that underpin our modern world. Picture this movie scene. A knight in shining armour clumsily stumbles across the battlefield, gets knocked down, and then flails helplessly on the ground. An armoured turtle flipped onto its back, totally unable to get up without assistance. This image is one of the most popular, and one of the most false. It perpetuates the idea that a knight's suit of armour was impossibly heavy and totally restrictive. Let's look at the facts regarding weight and mobility. A full suit of plate armour from the late Middle Ages, the 15th and 16th centuries, weighed, on average, between 20 and 25 kilograms. That's a significant amount of weight, yes, but it wasn't excessive or prohibitive. A modern soldier in full combat gear often carries considerably more. The key factor was how that weight was distributed. The armour was made up of many articulated plates, and its mass was spread evenly across the entire body, rather than being concentrated solely on the shoulders. Beneath the armour, the knight wore a padded jacket, a gambeson, or acqueton, which absorbed shock and prevented chafing. Armouring masters were true engineers. They crafted suits that were perfectly tailored to the wearer's body. A good suit of armour was essentially a second skin made of steel. In it, a knight could not only walk and fight, but also run, jump, mount a horse, and yes, even somersault or tumble. Historical evidence and modern reconstructions prove this is true. Armoured knights could climb ladders during sieges, fight on foot, and perform complex acrobatic manoeuvres to demonstrate their agility. Of course, armour was hot. It limited visibility, and it required the wearer to have excellent physical fitness. But it absolutely did not turn the warrior into a clumsy, shuffling robot. The myth of the clumsy knight is largely rooted in jousting armour. These suits were indeed heavier and bulkier than combat armour, sometimes weighing up to 40 kilograms, because their primary purpose was maximum protection against lance strikes, not mobility during sustained combat. Confusing specialised sporting equipment with standard battlefield gear is a major historical error. Therefore, a knight who fell to the ground was perfectly capable of getting back up on his own and continuing the fight. Following the myth of impossibly heavy armour comes the myth of the giant sword. In fantasy movies and games, heroes often swing blades that are man-sized and look like they must weigh 100 pounds or more. The reality is that medieval swords were elegant, balanced, and surprisingly light weapons. Let's take a look at the main types. The most common type was the single-handed, or Carolingian, Romanesque sword. These typically weighed between 1 and 1.5 kilograms. That's about the weight of a modern sport fencing weapon. They were light enough for swift cuts and parries, yet still held enough mass to deliver serious damage. As armour advanced, the so-called hand-and-a-half sword, or bastard sword, emerged. This could be wielded with one hand or two. Its weight rarely exceeded 2 kilograms. It offered an advantage in striking power against plate armour, but remained highly manoeuvrable. Finally, we have the famous two-handed swords, the Zweihander or the Claymore. These seem like they should be the giants we see in the movies, but they weren't. Even the largest true battlefield two-handers rarely weighed more than 3 or 4 kilograms. While they were incredibly long, up to 180 centimetres, their weight was meticulously balanced. The centre of gravity was kept close to the hilt, making them surprisingly manageable. This wasn't a weapon for just anyone. It demanded immense strength and technique, and was primarily used to break through dense pike formations. The key to a sword's effectiveness wasn't its raw weight, but its balance and blade geometry. The master bladesmiths were true experts of their craft. They forged weapons that served as true extensions of the warrior's arm. Swords were not mere chunks of sharpened steel, but complex killing instruments, designed with a deep understanding of physics and biomechanics. So where did the myth of the unmanageably heavy sword come from? Likely from ceremonial or parade swords, which could indeed be large and heavy, but were never intended for combat. And of course, from the desire of filmmakers to create a more impressive and brutal image of the warrior, sacrificing historical accuracy for the sake of spectacle. The right of the first knight, or droit du seigneur, stands as one of the most sensational and disturbing myths surrounding the Middle Ages. The myth claims that a feudal lord had the legal right to spend the wedding night with the bride of any of his vassals or peasants. This custom is often dramatically depicted in films like Braveheart, to emphasise the tyranny and depravity of the aristocracy. Truly horrifying, isn't it? The good news is that this is, almost certainly, a complete fabrication. Historians, after thoroughly examining medieval laws and documents, have found no conclusive evidence that such a law ever existed. There isn't a single legal code that enshrined it. So, where did this myth come from? Its roots trace back to later eras, primarily the Enlightenment. Writers and philosophers, notably Voltaire, used this fictional tale as a powerful weapon in their struggle against the aristocracy and what they called feudal barbarism. It was a vivid and shocking image that perfectly served to discredit the old order. It is possible, however, that the myth is based on a real practice of a completely different nature. There was something called a marriage ransom, or for mariage. This was essentially a tax that a serf had to pay their lord for permission to marry, especially if the bride came from a different estate. The lord was, in a sense, losing a worker, and the tax compensated for that loss. Over time, critics of feudalism likely distorted and exaggerated this financial custom, transforming it into a symbol of sexual exploitation. Of course, we cannot deny that powerful feudal lords often abused their authority and coerced women. Sexual violence has always existed, but that was an act of lawlessness and abuse of power, not an institutionalized legal right. The Church, incidentally, actively fought against promiscuity and upheld the sanctity of marriage. Thus, the rite of the first night is not a historical fact, but a powerful propaganda tool created to slander an entire era. It is a striking example of how a fiction, repeated often enough, begins to be accepted as immutable truth. The image of massive bonfires where women accused of witchcraft writhe in the flames is an essential part of the cinematic version of the Middle Ages. We often picture the Inquisition as a ruthless machine dedicated solely to burning witches. While this dramatic image is based on real tragic events, it severely distorts both the timeline and the scale of the persecutions. The main distortion, however, is chronological. The so-called Great Witch Hunt, the peak of mass hysteria and executions, did not happen during the Middle Ages at all. Instead, it occurred during the early modern period, roughly between 1560 and 1660. This was the era of the Renaissance, the Reformation, and scientific discovery. The medieval church was actually far more skeptical of witchcraft. During the early Middle Ages, the belief that witches could fly on brooms or make pacts with the devil was widely dismissed as pagan superstition. One foundational early church decree, the Canon Episcopi, explicitly condemned the belief in witches' nocturnal flights, deeming it an illusion induced by the devil. Punishments for sorcery certainly existed, but they were relatively mild, usually involving ecclesiastical penance. The situation began to shift in the late Middle Ages during the 13th and 14th centuries, as theologians started developing more complex demonological theories. Even so, the resulting witch trials remained isolated incidents and were never truly mass events. The medieval Inquisition was primarily established to combat heresy, that is, alternative interpretations of Christian doctrine, such as the Cathars or the Waldensians, not witches. The mass witch hunt was a product of its own specific era, a time of profound social, religious and political upheaval. The Reformation had fractured Europe, and religious wars bred pervasive fear and hatred. In this atmosphere of widespread suspicion, the belief in massive witch conspiracies found fertile ground. Furthermore, the persecutions were carried out not only by Catholic courts, but also by Protestant ones, and often secular authorities proved even more brutal than their ecclesiastical counterparts. So, the next time you see a movie scene depicting a witch burning against the backdrop of a Gothic cathedral, remember this: it's a chronological error. The true horrors of the witch hunts unfolded long after the Middle Ages had come to an end. The chastity belt is yet another notorious symbol of the dark and brutal Middle Ages, a favourite trope for dramas and comedies alike. It's the horrifying metal contraption supposedly locked onto a wife by a jealous knight heading off on a crusade, all to guarantee her fidelity. This vivid image has become firmly embedded in the popular imagination. However, much like the myth of the rite of the first night, historians have serious doubts about its actual widespread use. A closer examination reveals that the overwhelming majority of chastity belts displayed in museums today are, in fact, 19th century fakes. During the Victorian era, a time obsessed with morality and repressed sexuality, there was an immense appetite for these kinds of medieval artifacts. Many were manufactured specifically during that period to satisfy the demand from collectors and the eager public. If we consider the practicalities, the actual use of such a device would have been extremely problematic. First, there's the issue of hygiene. Wearing a metal belt for extended periods, especially without modern antiseptics, would inevitably lead to severe skin irritation, chafing, and life-threatening infections. It wouldn't just be uncomfortable, it would be deadly. Secondly, what about basic bodily functions? Any usable design would require openings, which would effectively negate its entire protective function. The earliest references and illustrations of chastity belts appear not in medieval chronicles, but in Renaissance texts and engravings, often presented in a satirical or allegorical context. For instance, a 15th century book features an illustration of such a belt, but the depiction is clearly intended to be humorous. It's plausible that chastity belts existed not as real objects, but as a metaphor, a joke, or perhaps even an early sadomasochistic device, but certainly not as a widespread domestic tool for controlling women. The notion that knights routinely locked their wives in iron is a fabrication of later eras that sought to portray the Middle Ages as a time of barbarity and female subjugation. Imagine a Viking. What image immediately springs to mind? Of course, it's a mighty, bearded warrior wearing a helmet adorned with horns. This iconic image is everywhere, in movies, cartoons, comics, and even as the emblem of professional sports teams. It is the most recognizable Viking attribute, yet it is also the biggest historical hoax. Here is the truth. Archaeologists have never found a single helmet from the actual Viking age, the 8th through 11th centuries, that had horns. All unearthed helmets, like the famous Skjermundbu helmet found in Norway, are simply conical or rounded, sometimes featuring a nose or cheek guard. These helmets were purely functional, designed solely to protect the head in battle. Horns would not just be useless decoration, they would be fatally dangerous. An enemy's sword or axe could easily hook onto a horn, potentially ripping the helmet off, or even worse, breaking the wearer's neck. Vikings were pragmatic, experienced warriors. They would never have worn such impractical gear. So, where did this myth come from? Its origins trace back to the Romantic era of the 19th century. Europeans, particularly in Scandinavia and Germany, were rediscovering their perceived barbaric past. Artists and writers set out to create a heroic and dramatic image of ancient Germanic peoples and Vikings. The artist Carl Emil Dupler played a crucial role in popularizing the horned helmet. He designed the costumes for Richard Wagner's opera, Der Ring des Nibelungen, which premiered in 1876. It was Dupler who placed those dramatic horned helmets on the heads of the opera's Viking characters. The visual was so powerful and striking that it instantly became associated with Vikings, cementing its place in popular culture. Now, there might be a grain of truth influencing this image, stemming from much older finds. For instance, ceremonial Bronze Age helmets, long before the Viking era, have been found with horns, but these were used for rituals, not combat. Additionally, priests among ancient Germanic and Celtic tribes sometimes wore horned headgear, but none of this has any connection to the actual Vikings who terrified medieval Europe. The enduring myth that during the Middle Ages everyone, from peasant to king, believed the earth was flat, and that Christopher Columbus was a daring genius who defied this universal ignorance, is one of history's most persistent misconceptions. This narrative is often used to sharply contrast the dark, superstitious Middle Ages with the enlightened age of exploration. The truth is that virtually all educated people during the Middle Ages knew the Earth was spherical. This fundamental knowledge was never lost after classical antiquity. Ancient Greek scholars, including Pythagoras, Plato, and Aristotle, had provided convincing evidence for the Earth's sphericity, such as the curved shadow cast on the moon during an eclipse, or the changing position of stars when travelling north or south. Their works were well known to medieval academics. Influential early medieval thinkers like the Venerable Bede and Isidore of Seville wrote about the globe's shape of the Earth as an established fact. Later, sphericity became a standard part of the university curriculum. Thomas Aquinas, one of the era's greatest theologians, spoke without reservation about the planet's spherical form. This awareness is even reflected in art. Many depictions show monarchs holding an orb, a sphere topped with a cross, symbolising the Earth under Christ's dominion. So, what was the actual dispute between Columbus and the scholars at the royal court? They argued not about the shape of the Earth, but its size. Based on faulty calculations, Columbus believed the Earth was much smaller than reality. He estimated that sailing west to Asia would take only a few weeks. His opponents, relying on more accurate classical measurements, argued that the distance was far greater, and no ship of that era could carry enough supplies to survive such a journey. And they were right. Columbus simply got lucky that an unknown continent appeared on his route. The flat Earth myth was actually created and popularized in the 19th century by authors like Washington Irving and John Draper as part of their campaign against the perceived influence of religion on science. They fabricated a cartoonish image that has, unfortunately, proven to be very resilient. Life was short and brutal. People were considered old at 30, and few ever made it to 40. This phrase often appears in documentaries and fiction, painting a picture of a world almost exclusively populated by the young. This myth stems from a fundamental misinterpretation of statistical data. It is true that the average life expectancy during the Middle Ages was shockingly low, somewhere between 30 and 35 years. However, this figure is an arithmetic average, heavily skewed by incredibly high rates of infant and child mortality. Lacking antibiotics, vaccines, and modern understanding of hygiene, many children succumb to easily curable diseases during their first year of life or early childhood. But if a child survived this dangerous period and reached, say, the age of 21, their chances of living a long life soared. An adult who reached maturity could realistically expect to live into their 60s, 70s, and sometimes even their 80s. History provides ample examples of longevity. King Edward III of England, for instance, reigned for 50 years and died at the age of 64. The renowned Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen first of France and then of England, lived past 80, remaining an influential political figure until her death. The philosopher and theologian Albertus Magnus died at approximately 87 years old. Of course, life was fraught with peril, wars, famine, and devastating epidemics like the Black Death, which claimed the lives of 1/3 of Europe's population in the 14th century. All dramatically affected demography. But that still doesn't mean people grew old and died at 30. The idea of a senior citizen at age 30 is absurd. At this age, people were in the prime of their lives. A knight would be gaining crucial battlefield experience, a merchant would be building their trade empire, and a peasant would be the head of a large, productive family. Thus, the low average life expectancy tells us less about universal early death and more about the immense challenge of surviving childhood. Those who managed to reach maturity often lived just as long as their descendants did centuries later, before the true medical revolution began. Movie depictions of medieval feasts often paint a brutal picture. Nobles and knights savagely tearing meat apart with their hands, tossing bones to the dogs beneath the table, and wiping their greasy fingers on their clothing. Cutlery, it seems, was limited to just a knife and perhaps a spoon. The fork, conversely, is often portrayed as a strange, delicate item that only appeared much later. In reality, the history of eating utensils is far more complex. Knives and spoons were indeed the primary personal utensils throughout the entire Middle Ages. Guests often brought their own knife to a feast, and spoons were used for soups, potages, and sauces. The story of the fork, however, is much more interesting. It wasn't invented in the modern era, it was known centuries before. Small two-pronged forks were used as far back as ancient Rome and Byzantium, and it was from Byzantium that the fork began its slow journey into Europe. In the 11th century, a Byzantine princess married a Venetian doge and brought the utensil with her to Italy. Initially, Italians were suspicious of the fork, viewing it as excessive luxury and a sign of effeminacy. One clergyman even famously denounced it as a devil's instrument. However, thanks to Italy's strong trade links with the East, the fork gradually took hold on the Apennine Peninsula, especially among the wealthy city dwellers. It proved practical for eating pasta and syrupy fruits without dirtying one's hands. The rest of Europe was much slower to adopt it. In France, it didn't truly come into fashion until the 16th century, largely due to Catherine de' Medici. It became common in England and Germany even later. So, if a film is set in, say, 13th century France, the lack of forks on the king's table is historically accurate. But if the setting is Renaissance Italy, those forks definitely should be there. It's crucial to understand that medieval table etiquette was actually very strict, especially in high society. Entire treatises were written detailing the rules of behaviour at a feast. You couldn't chew noisily, talk with your mouth full, or pick your teeth with a knife. Hands were washed both before and after the meal. Guests ate using only 3 fingers, being careful not to soil their palms. Thus, the image of a wild, uncivilized medieval banquet is largely another caricature created purely for public amusement. Movies give us the impression that the Middle Ages were nothing but one long, continuous war. Knights seem to spend all their time either clashing in tournaments or fighting endless battles. Peasants constantly suffer from raids, and peace is merely a brief pause between bloody massacres. Undeniably, the medieval era was characterized by frequent armed conflicts, feudal fragmentation, succession disputes, crusades, and raids by Vikings, followed later by the Mongols. All these factors made warfare a familiar backdrop to daily life. However, the notion of perpetual warfare across the whole of Europe is a significant exaggeration. Firstly, wars were largely seasonal. Campaigns typically commenced in the spring, once enough fodder was available for the horses and mounts, and concluded in the autumn before the harvest. Active hostilities usually ceased during the winter months. Secondly, the scale of engagements was not comparable to the conflicts of the early modern period. Armies were relatively small, ranging from a few hundred to a few thousand soldiers. Major battles involving tens of thousands of warriors were rare, epical events. Far more often, warfare consisted of a series of sieges, minor skirmishes, raiding parties, and strategic manoeuvring. The primary goal was rarely to annihilate the enemy army in one decisive pitched battle, but rather to exhaust them economically, capture their strongholds, and force them into concessions. The Church also actively attempted to limit violence. It introduced the so-called Truce of God, or Treuga Day, which forbade military actions on certain days of the week, for instance, from Wednesday evening until Monday morning, and during major religious holidays. Furthermore, the Peace of God, or Pax Dei, was proclaimed, declaring clerics, women, children, peasants, and their property inviolable. Of course, these prohibitions were frequently violated, but the mere existence of these doctrines demonstrates society's effort to establish some framework, however fragile, for warfare. Thus, while warfare was undeniably a significant part of medieval life, it was neither total nor continuous. Long periods of peace were common, and most people, especially peasants, could live their entire lives without ever witnessing a true battle. Whenever medieval taverns appear on screen, the tables are invariably laden with massive tankards of beer or ale. Characters are often shown drinking it with breakfast, lunch, and dinner. This cinematic trope suggests that water was so filthy and dangerous that nobody dared drink it, preferring alcohol instead. While this myth holds a grain of truth, it heavily exaggerates the reality. It's true that beer and ale and wine in southern regions were incredibly popular beverages. They were nutritious, packed with calories, which was essential for those engaged in hard physical labour. Furthermore, the brewing process itself, which involves boiling, killed most harmful bacteria, making the resulting drink significantly safer than water from a questionable source. However, this absolutely does not mean that people avoided water entirely. Water quality largely depended on where you lived. In rural areas where clean springs, wells, and rivers were common, people drank water without issue. The situation was definitely more complicated in cities due to widespread pollution. Even so, authorities worked hard to solve the problem. Aqueducts, public fountains, and wells were constructed to provide citizens with clean water. Monasteries, in particular, were known for having sophisticated water supply systems. It's crucial to understand that medieval beer and ale were drastically different from what we drink today. They were much, much weaker. You could compare them roughly to modern non-alcoholic kvass or a very light soft drink. It was viewed more as liquid bread than an intoxicating beverage and was even routinely given to children. Different strengths existed. Strong ale was reserved for feasts and celebrations, while light ale was meant for daily consumption. So when we see a character downing several litres of beer in one sitting, we must remember that the alcoholic content was likely extremely low. Beyond beer and water, people consumed many other beverages. Milk and dairy products like whey formed an important part of the diet. Wealthier households drank diluted wine, alongside various fruit juices and ciders. Therefore, the blanket statement that everyone drank only beer because the water was poisonous is a vast oversimplification. The choice of drink depended heavily on the region, social status, the season, and the availability of clean water sources, and the beer itself was fundamentally more of a food staple than a means of intoxication or entertainment. The life of a medieval peasant, as often depicted in films, is one of unrelenting misery. They toil from dawn till dusk, eat turnip stew, live in dark hovels, and know no joy outside of perhaps the occasional church holiday. Their existence is painted as monotonous, boring, and filled with suffering. While this image certainly captures the sheer difficulty of peasant labour, and it was hard, dictated by the whims of the weather, it completely overlooks the social and cultural vibrancy of village life. Peasants formed the vast majority of the population and bore the primary burden of taxes and duties. However, their lives were not solely defined by work. First, peasants enjoyed a surprising number of days off. The church calendar was packed with holy days, Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, and numerous saints' days. Altogether, these could amount to 80 or even 90 non-working days per year. These holidays were celebrated communally, featuring large feasts, dancing, games, and local fairs. It was a vital time for rest and social engagement. Second, the peasant community held significant autonomy. Villages elected their own elders or headmen and maintained their own local courts to settle minor disputes between neighbours. They also managed shared lands such as common pastures and forests. Village life was highly collective. People regularly helped each other during planting and harvesting, and cooperated on building houses or repairing roads. While conflicts certainly arose, the sense of community was incredibly strong. Third, peasants had genuine leisure time. During the winter, when agricultural work slowed down, they engaged in crafts, weaving, repairing tools, or basket making. Evenings were often spent gathered together to share folk tales, legends, or listen to songs performed by travelling minstrels. They also had organised entertainment, including wrestling matches, ball games, early forms of football, and even inter-village fistfights. A peasant's life was undeniably hard and full of privation, but it was far from unrelentingly bleak. It had room for celebration, creativity, and vital social interaction. To reduce their existence merely to back-breaking labour is to strip these people of their human dignity and ignore the rich culture they actively created. The medieval woman, as portrayed in popular culture, is typically seen as a completely powerless and oppressed figure. Her only role, we are told, was to bear children, keep house, and submit entirely to men. First her father, then her husband. She supposedly had no voice, no property rights, and zero chance for self-realization. However, this image is a vast oversimplification. A woman standing in the Middle Ages was highly complex and deeply tied to her social status, but it was far from utterly powerless. Within peasant society, a woman often functioned as a full and equal partner to her husband. She didn't just manage the home and raise the children, she worked the fields side by side with men, tended the garden plot, and looked after the animals. Women frequently practiced trades like brewing ale or weaving textiles, providing vital supplementary income for the family. Critically, after her husband passed away, a widow inherited the farmstead and became its sole, legally recognised head. Urban women also played a significant economic role. They were permitted to join craft guilds, own their own workshops, and run businesses. Large numbers of women worked in textile production, the food trade, and, crucially, in managing taverns and inns. A married woman living in the city was often a recognised and active business partner to her husband. The aristocratic setting presented a different dynamic. While marriage was fundamentally a political and economic alliance, this doesn't mean the woman was merely a pawn. When her husband was away on campaign or at war, managing the vast estate and castle household, the lady often became the de facto ruler of his lands. She supervised all the servants, maintained the accounts, and even organised the castle's defences. History offers countless examples of powerful and influential women, queens, regents, and abbesses. Figures such as Eleanor of Aquitaine, Blanche of Castile, and Empress Matilda actively intervened in high-stakes politics and governance. Of course, patriarchal society imposed serious limitations. Women were barred from holding most state offices, becoming judges, or serving as priests. Their access to formal education was also restricted, but to reduce their lives to mere total submission and a lack of rights is to willfully ignore their genuine contribution to the economy, culture, and even the politics of the era. They were not passive victims, but active participants in the historical process. The knight on a white horse embodies nobility, honour and gallantry. He protects the weak, serves his fair lady, and always adheres to a strict code of conduct. This romantic image, initially forged by courtly literature and later popularised by writers like Sir Walter Scott, is deeply ingrained in our collective consciousness. However, the historical medieval knight was rarely this ideal figure. Knighthood was first and foremost a military class. A knight was a professional, heavily armed cavalryman. Their primary duty was fighting, and warfare in the Middle Ages was brutal business. Pillage, violence against civilians, and taking hostages for ransom was standard practice. The same knight who might gallantly woo a lady in a poem could in reality burn down a village belonging to his lord's enemy without a second thought. The chivalric code of honour certainly existed. It encompassed concepts like loyalty to one's liege lord, bravery in battle, protection of the church, and generosity. But these rules primarily governed relationships between equals, that is, other knights. When dealing with common folk, a knight often felt few, if any, obligations. Peasants were seen merely as a source of income and cannon fodder. Courtly love, or the service of a fair lady, was more a literary and cultural phenomenon than a day-to-day reality. It was an elaborate game popular among the highest noble courts, intended to soften the often crude manners of warriors. Crucially, it seldom related to real marriage, which, as we know, was primarily a transaction. Of course, some knights genuinely strove to live up to the high ideal. History offers examples of true nobility and self-sacrifice, but the majority of knights were simply products of their harsh era. They could simultaneously be pious Christians and ruthless killers, generous patrons and avaricious plunderers. The idealized image of the knight, without fear and beyond reproach, is a beautiful legend that bears little resemblance to historical reality. The real knight was a complex and contradictory figure, not a cardboard hero from a romance novel. In movies, castles are often depicted as gloomy, cold, and uncomfortable stone prisons. Bare walls, echoing corridors, dim torchlight, and constant drafts. Life inside them seems unbearably harsh, even for their wealthy owners. However, this image is only partly true. A castle was primarily a fortress, and its main function was defence. Thick walls, narrow arrow slits, and massive gates were simply necessities required for protection. But that doesn't mean the interiors were entirely devoid of comfort. Medieval people, just like us, tried to make their dwellings as livable and cosy as possible. The walls of the living quarters were certainly not bare. They were either plastered and whitewashed, then decorated with bright frescoes and ornamentation, or even better, they were draped in tapestries and expensive fabrics. These tapestries didn't just decorate the interior and showcase the owner's wealth. They also served a vital practical function, retaining warmth and protecting against drafts. The floors, which might be stone, tiled, or wooden, were covered with rugs, a luxury item imported from the East, or, in more modest dwellings, woven straw mats that were changed frequently. The main source of heat and light was the fireplace. In the early Middle Ages, this was just a central hearth with a smoke hole in the roof, but later, wall-mounted fireplaces with proper chimneys appeared, which were far more efficient. They not only heated the room, but also provided a genuine sense of comfort. Besides the main hearths, braziers filled with hot coals were also used. Illumination wasn't limited to the smoky, sputtering torches, which were primarily confined to service areas and exterior walls. Living quarters relied on candles, cheap tallow candles for commoners, and expensive beeswax candles for the nobility, which offered a steady light and a pleasant scent. Oil lamps were also used. Furniture was massive and highly functional. Canopy beds, which provided protection from the cold, large storage chests, tables, and benches. Therefore, while a medieval castle certainly couldn't rival the comfort of a modern home, it was far from the dreary, uncomfortable place often portrayed by cinema. Anarchy, chaos, and rampant banditry. That's the image the movies paint of the Middle Ages. We often assume there were no laws or courts, and that every dispute was settled purely by the force of a sword. We believe travelling the roads was supposedly deadly, with robbers hiding behind every bush. But this picture of lawlessness is highly exaggerated. Medieval society was, in fact, incredibly complex and strictly regulated. A sophisticated, multi-layered legal system was firmly in place. First, there was customary law, built on centuries of tradition and local practices. This governed peasant community life, family relations, and inheritance issues. Second, there was feudal law, which defined the crucial relationship between lords and vassals, dealing with oaths of loyalty, military service, and land ownership. Third, as cities grew, urban law developed, such as the widely influential Magdeburg Law. This granted citizens self-governance and protected their commercial interests. Finally, there was canon law, the law of the Church, which regulated marriage, morality, and all clerical matters. Furthermore, starting in the 12th century, Europe saw a significant revival of Roman law, which eventually became the foundation for many modern legal systems. The judicial system was equally layered. Every feudal lord operated his own court for his vassals and tenants. Cities ran their own municipal courts. The church had its independent jurisdiction, and royal courts existed, whose power steadily increased over time. Court proceedings were often complex and highly formalised. Evidence relied heavily on witness testimony and written documents. Yes, archaic practices like trial by combat or ordeals, such as the test by water or fire, did exist. However, these slowly faded, especially after the Church formally forbade their use in the year 1215. Of course, law enforcement was far from perfect. A powerful feudal lord could easily ignore a court's ruling, and road banditry was a very real problem, particularly during periods of civil strife. But this doesn't mean law didn't exist at all. On the contrary, medieval people were deeply preoccupied with issues of justice and rights. Their world was built upon laws, contracts, and oaths, not on total anarchy. Hollywood often portrays the Inquisition as an all-powerful secret police force, with agents lurking everywhere, hunting heretics. We picture every monastery basement equipped with gruesome torture chambers, racks, Spanish boots, and iron maidens. This entire image, however, was largely fabricated by Protestant propaganda and subsequent anti-clerical literature. The real medieval Inquisition was far more complex and much less pervasive than the myths suggest. The Inquisition, derived from the Latin inquisitio, meaning investigation, was established in the 13th century as a special ecclesiastical tribunal. Its purpose was to combat heresies, which the Church viewed as a grave threat to the salvation of souls and social stability. Crucially, it was not a single centralised organisation. Different countries operated their own tribunals, reporting either to local bishops or directly to the Pope. Inquisitors were typically well-educated theologians, often drawn from the Dominican or Franciscan orders. Their primary goal was not to torture or execute, but rather to bring the heretic back into the Church through repentance. The inquisitorial process was strictly regulated. The accused was informed of the charges and given an opportunity to defend themselves and present witnesses. The use of torture was indeed permitted by a papal bull in 1252, but with severe limitations. It was meant to be applied only once, and strictly without causing mutilation or bloodshed. While these rules were frequently violated, leading to abuses, torture was neither the main nor the mandatory part of the process. Psychological pressure, intense interrogations, and imprisonment were far more commonly employed. Most inquisitorial sentences did not result in death. The most common punishments were acts of penance, pilgrimages, wearing distinguishing marks on clothing, or imposing fines. Execution by burning at the stake was reserved only for obstinate, unrepentant heretics and those who relapsed. Crucially, the execution itself was always carried out by the secular authorities, not by the Church. The scale of the Inquisition's operations is also highly exaggerated. It operated locally, primarily in regions where heresies were particularly strong, for instance, in southern France against the Cathars. It was virtually non-existent in places like England and Scandinavia. The notorious Spanish Inquisition, known for its severity, was a much later development, dating from the late 15th century, and operated under the strong control of the monarchy. Thus, the image of an omnipresent, universally torturing Inquisition is a product of the Black legend, not historical reality. The way medieval cuisine is shown in movies is usually one of two extremes, either meagre peasant gruel or massive piles of spit-roasted meat for the aristocracy. This gives the impression that the food was coarse, monotonous, and often spoiled. In reality, however, cooking, at least for those who could afford it, was a complex and sophisticated art form. The biggest difference between medieval and modern cuisine was the intense love for spices. Spices weren't just used to mask the taste of spoiled meat. That's actually another popular myth, as nobody wasted expensive seasonings on bad ingredients. Spices were, instead, a potent symbol of status and immense wealth. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, pepper and saffron, all imported from the East, costing truly extravagant sums. Dishes were seasoned heavily, creating complex flavour profiles that would seem unusual to us today. For example, meat was often cooked with fruit and sugar, incorporating vinegar for a sharp tang. Sweet and sour sauces were incredibly popular. Medieval chefs loved to surprise and even deceive their guests. They created so-called entremets, or intercourse dishes, designed to look like one thing while tasting completely different. For instance, they might prepare fish to look exactly like a joint of meat, or craft an entire castle, complete with turrets, out of coloured almond paste. At grand banquets, roasted peacocks or swans would be served, often carefully redressed in their own feathers to appear lifelike. While meat consumption was indeed high, it wasn't just roasted. It was boiled, stewed, and turned into rich pâtés and pies. Besides beef, pork and mutton, people ate a great deal of game, venison, wild boar, and rabbit, as well as countless varieties of birds, ranging from chickens to exotic fowl like cranes and herons. Fish was a crucial part of the diet, largely because the church calendar dictated numerous fast days when meat was strictly forbidden. Fish was salted, smoked, dried, and eaten fresh. Vegetables and fruits were also abundant. Cabbage, turnip, onions, garlic, peas, beans, apples, pears, plums, and cherries. Bread was the backbone of the table, though it varied widely, ranging from coarse rye bread for the poor to fluffy white loaves made from fine wheat flour for the nobility. In summary, far from being primitive or bland, medieval cuisine was rich, diverse, and full of surprising complexity. When a medieval character smiles on screen, we usually expect a gap-toothed grin or a mouthful of rotten stumps. The prevailing belief is that dentistry didn't exist, oral hygiene was unheard of, and everyone lost their teeth by adulthood. However, this common stereotype isn't entirely accurate. Surprisingly, the dental health of medieval people was, in some respects, better than that of individuals in subsequent eras, right up until the 20th century. The main reason for this difference comes down to diet. The primary enemy of teeth is sugar. During the Middle Ages, sugar was an incredibly expensive import, affordable only to the very top echelon of society. Most people consumed very little of it. Their diets were based on whole grains, vegetables and legumes, rough, fibrous foods that required vigorous chewing and naturally helped clean the teeth. Of course, this doesn't mean they had no dental issues. Cavities certainly existed, but they were far less prevalent than they became once sugar became cheap and widely available. The much bigger problem was dental wear. Due to the coarse diet combined with sand and tiny stone fragments getting into the flour from the grinding stones, tooth enamel would gradually wear away. This could expose the dentin and pulp, causing pain and severe infections. Oral hygiene, though primitive by modern standards, was practiced. People rinsed their mouths with water or wine and cleaned their teeth using a piece of cloth dipped in a mixture of salt water or ash. Toothpicks were also common. Medical treatises even contained recipes for powders and elixirs intended to whiten teeth and freshen breath, often featuring herbs like mint, sage, and rosemary. If a tooth ached severely, extraction was the standard remedy. This procedure was carried out not only by doctors, but also by barbers and even blacksmiths. Since anesthesia was unavailable, the process was excruciating and often led to complications. Nonetheless, the notion that everyone universally walked around toothless is a vast overstatement. Archaeological evidence shows that many medieval individuals retained the majority of their natural teeth well into old age. The very word medieval, in modern language, is often used as a synonym for everything cruel, primitive, backward, and stupid. We hear phrases like medieval barbarism, medieval torture, and the medieval mindset. We use this term to describe anything that seems utterly irrational and savage to us. This use of the word is a direct inheritance of the black legend created during the Enlightenment. It cements a cartoonish and utterly unhistorical image of an entire 1,000-year epoch in our minds. As we have already seen when analysing previous myths, the Middle Ages were neither primitive nor stupid. It was a time of incredibly complex philosophical debates, impressive engineering achievements, and the creation of monumental works of art and literature. The medieval mindset wasn't stupid, it was simply different. It was deeply religious, symbolic, and hierarchical. The world was perceived as God's creation, where every person and every phenomenon had its own predetermined place. This worldview is radically different from our own scientific and secular perspective, but it had its own internal logic and coherence. To label it backward is to show arrogance and historical ignorance, judging the past solely by contemporary standards. Cruelty and violence were undeniably a part of medieval life, but were they really more brutal than, say, the horrors of the 20th century, with its world wars, genocide, and totalitarian regimes? Medieval tortures are indeed horrific, yet the guillotine of the Enlightenment or the gas chambers are products of arguably more civilized eras. Every age possesses its unique forms of cruelty. Demonizing the Middle Ages prevents us from appreciating its true face. This was the foundational period for European nations, languages, and states. It was the era that gave us universities, parliaments, Gothic cathedrals, Romanesque architecture, Gregorian chant, chivalric romance, and countless other elements that form the bedrock of our modern civilization. By moving past the derogatory label of medieval, we uncover a complex, multifaceted, and astonishingly vibrant world that deserves thorough study and respect, not contempt. Many people imagine medieval society as static. The common belief is that a peasant was born and died in the same village, never venturing beyond its borders. Travel was reserved only for a few brave souls, merchants, pilgrims, or knights. For the vast majority, the world ended at the edge of their home village. However, this image of a sedentary Middle Ages is far from the truth. People travelled significantly more than we often assume, despite the immense difficulty and danger involved. One of the primary drivers of movement was religion. Pilgrimages to holy sites were a mass phenomenon. Thousands of people across Europe set out on foot to Rome, to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, or even as far as Jerusalem. These weren't just monks and aristocrats. They included ordinary artisans and peasants. Along these pilgrimage routes, entire infrastructures sprang up, inns, hospitals, and bridges to accommodate the travellers. Trade also mandated mobility. Merchants travelled colossal distances, forming robust trade leagues like the Hanseatic League. They transported silks and spices from Asia, wool from England, and wine from France. Rivers and sea lanes served as bustling arteries connecting distant corners of Europe. War was yet another catalyst for movement. Knights and soldiers embarked on crusades, fought in feudal conflicts, or served as mercenaries in foreign armies. These journeys often covered thousands of miles. Scholars and students were also highly mobile. They frequently migrated from one university to another, from Bologna to Paris, or from Paris to Oxford, in search of the best professors. Latin served as the universal language of academia, greatly facilitating this intellectual exchange. Even peasants were not entirely tied to their land. During times of famine or warfare, they often migrated to cities searching for a better life. The famous saying was, "City air makes you free." If a serf managed to live in a town for a year and a day, they officially gained their freedom. Of course, travel was slow and inherently dangerous. Roads were poor, and bandits posed a constant real threat. But these obstacles didn't halt the flow of people. The medieval world was a world in motion, traversed by a vital network of routes that connected pilgrims, merchants, soldiers, and scholars, forging a unified cultural and economic space. Every movie castle siege features impressive shots of massive projectile weapons in action. Giant catapults and trebuchets hurl massive stones, flaming projectiles, and even, famous in Monty Python, cows at the walls. This leads to the impression that these machines were standard, ubiquitous weapons. While siege engines certainly played a critical role in warfare, their use was neither as frequent nor as simple as Hollywood suggests. Firstly, we must differentiate between the types of machines. What movies often label a catapult is usually either an onager, a torsion engine powered by twisted ropes, or, far more commonly and effectively, a trebuchet. The trebuchet is a gravity-powered counterweight weapon capable of launching exceptionally heavy projectiles over long distances. It represented the pinnacle of medieval siege engineering. Secondly, constructing and operating these machines was an incredibly complicated and expensive undertaking. The trebuchet was a massive, complex structure, often built right at the siege site from prefabricated components. Maintaining it required a dedicated team of skilled engineers and soldiers. This was specialised, elite weaponry, available only to kings or extremely wealthy feudal lords who could afford a protracted and costly siege. Thirdly, their effectiveness wasn't always as high as depicted on screen. Breaching a thick castle wall was extremely difficult. It required substantial time and repeated, accurate hits to the exact same spot. More often, Siege engines were used not for direct wall destruction, but for demoralizing the defenders. They could launch not only stones and incendiary devices over the walls, but also severed heads of prisoners or the carcasses of dead animals to spread disease. It was essentially a form of psychological warfare. Most sieges in the Middle Ages did not end with a spectacular wall breach and direct assault. Instead, the castle was usually taken by starvation, cutting off its supply lines, by cunning, or through betrayal. Therefore, while the trebuchet was a formidable weapon, it was not the universal key to unlocking every castle. Its presence on the battlefield was the exception rather than the rule, signalling the extreme seriousness of the besieger's intent. When Hollywood portrays the grim reality and primitiveness of medieval life, windows in homes and castles are often depicted as nothing more than holes in the wall, perhaps covered only by an oiled cloth or an animal bladder. Glass windows, if they appear at all, are presented as an incredible luxury reserved exclusively for royal palaces. This view, however, is a massive oversimplification. Glass manufacturing technology was well established since Roman times and was certainly not lost during the Middle Ages. Granted, producing the perfectly flat, clear sheet glass we know today was extremely difficult and prohibitively expensive. But window glass did exist and was actively used. Churches and cathedrals famously used small pieces of coloured glass to create the enormous, intricate stained glass windows that remain one of the defining wonders of Gothic art. This alone proves the technology was highly developed. In fact, in castles and wealthy city homes, glass windows were not uncommon starting in the High Middle Ages. Typically, the window opening would be divided by stone or wooden tracery into several sections, which held small panes of glass, often diamond-shaped, fastened together with lead cames. While these windows were certainly not perfectly transparent, they allowed light in and provided far better protection from wind and cold than any other material available. For added insulation and privacy, windows were also often covered from the inside by heavy wooden shutters. It is true that in the homes of commoners, particularly in rural areas, glass windows were rare due to the expense. There, wall openings were kept small to conserve heat, and might genuinely be covered with oiled parchment, thin leather, animal bladders, or simply blocked at night with wooden boards. Nonetheless, even the humblest dwellings had some sort of opening, because light was essential for daily work and life. Therefore, the notion that the Middle Ages was an era without glass windows is simply inaccurate. Glass existed, it was used, and its widespread adoption was a matter of cost and social status, not technological capability. And in ecclesiastical architecture, it played a central role, literally flooding spaces with divine light. Movies often suggest that money was a rare commodity during the Middle Ages, portraying the economy as dominated by natural exchange or barter. We frequently see depictions of peasants paying their feudal lords with sacks of grain, or city shoemakers swapping boots for chickens. This popular image makes the monetary economy seem totally rudimentary. In reality, the use of currency never entirely ceased after the fall of the Roman Empire. While the economy did become more localized and reliant on natural goods during the early Middle Ages, a period marked by the decline of cities and trade, gold, silver and copper coins were continually minted and utilized. However, starting around the 10th and 11th centuries, with the rapid growth of cities, crafts and trade, the importance of currency grew exponentially. New silver deposits were discovered, significantly increasing the overall money supply. An enormous variety of coins entered circulation, minted not only by kings but also by powerful feudal lords, bishops, and autonomous cities. This posed immediate problems, as the coins varied widely in weight and metal purity. Therefore, money changers appeared in every major city, professionals who understood currency exchange rates and swapped one type of money for another. They were the forerunners of modern bankers. With the development of trade, particularly international trade, more sophisticated financial instruments emerged. Italian merchants invented the bill of exchange, a written debt obligation that allowed transactions to happen without physically moving large amounts of cash. This was both safe and convenient. The first banks also emerged, accepting deposits, issuing loans, and facilitating money transfers. Of course, in the villages, natural exchange and payments in kind played a major role. But even peasants needed money to pay certain taxes, such as the church tithe, or to buy essential goods in the city that they couldn't produce themselves, like salt and iron. Thus, the medieval economy was inherently mixed. It consisted of both subsistence farming and sophisticated commodity money relations. To reduce the entire system purely to barter is to ignore the full complexity and dynamism of the economic processes of that era. In medieval action movies, almost any injury from a sword or arrow, anything more than a scratch, is instantly fatal. If our hero is wounded in the abdomen or chest, he either dies heroically on the battlefield or suffers a painful lingering death over several days. This suggests that medicine was powerless against serious trauma. While mortality rates were certainly high due to the lack of antibiotics and the constant risk of infection, medieval doctors and surgeons were far from helpless. Centuries of constant warfare had equipped them with significant knowledge in traumatology. Surgeons knew how to staunch bleeding, using either cauterization with a hot iron or specialized styptic powders. They were skilled at extracting arrowheads and weapon fragments from wounds, utilizing a range of specialized surgical tools for the job. After foreign objects were removed, the wound was washed, often with wine, which, as we now know, possesses antiseptic properties. Bandages soaked in medicinal salves, made from herbs, honey, or egg white, were then applied to promote healing. One of the most common and dangerous procedures was the amputation of a shattered limb. This was performed extremely quickly to minimize pain and blood loss, utilizing specialized surgical saws. Survival rates were certainly low, but these operations offered the patient a fighting chance. Particular attention was paid to treating broken bones. Doctors knew how to set bones properly and apply splints to ensure correct healing. Archaeologists frequently uncover skeletons showing evidence of healed fractures, even very complex ones. Entire medical treatises were dedicated to military surgery. For instance, Chirurgia, Surgery, by Theodoric of Borgognoni, written in the 13th century, actually advocated for clean wound dressing and argued against the common practice of encouraging pus formation, which some physicians mistakenly believed was beneficial. This was an incredibly progressive approach for the era. Of course, infection remained the primary enemy. If septicemia, gangrene, or tetanus set in, saving the patient was virtually impossible. However, it is simply inaccurate to claim that every serious wound was a guaranteed death sentence. A skilled surgeon could save a soldier's life, and history provides countless examples of people surviving even the gravest injuries. And just like that, step by step, we've managed to debunk 30 of the most persistent myths about the Middle Ages. As you can now see, this era was nothing like the dark picture Hollywood paints. It was not 1,000 years of unrelenting darkness, squalor, and ignorance. Instead, it was a time of great achievement and striking contrasts, an era where the highest ideals of honour and service existed right alongside widespread cruelty and violence. It was a period that saw the construction of magnificent cathedrals and the opening of the very first universities. Human thought, while framed by religious worldview, certainly wasn't stagnant. The Middle Ages were vibrant, noisy, dynamic, and far more complex and fascinating than any movie version could ever portray. I hope this journey into the past was compelling and offered you a completely new perspective on history. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way through. If you learned something new and interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next myth-busting expose. Now I have a question for you. Which of these 30 myths surprised you the most? Or perhaps you know of other misconceptions about the Middle Ages that we didn't cover? Let me know in the comments below. Let's keep the discussion going. Until next time.